Did God command genocide in the Old Testament? The most morally disturbing question in all of Scripture. There is a passage in the Bible that has caused more people to close the book and walk away from faith than almost anything else, not because it is obscure or peripheral, but because it is direct, it is repeated, and it is attributed to God Himself. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, the prophet Samuel delivers a divine command to King Saul. He says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." Men, women, children, infants. The Hebrew word used is herem. It means total destruction, sacred annihilation, not military victory, not strategic conquest. The complete elimination of every living thing in a people group, commanded by the God who in the New Testament is described as love itself. How do you reconcile those two things? How do you hold in the same hand a God who says love your enemies and a God who orders the slaughter of babies? This is not a question that deserves a quick answer, a nervous deflection, or a theological sleight of hand. It is one of the hardest questions in all of religious thought. And today, we are going to face it with open eyes. First, let's be honest about the scope of the problem, because minimizing it does nobody any good. The Amalekites are not an isolated case. The book of Deuteronomy contains the herem command applied to the 7 nations of Canaan. In Deuteronomy 7, God instructs Israel, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land and drives out before you many nations, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy." In Numbers 31, following a battle with the Midianites, Moses is angry not because the Israelites killed people, but because they spared the women. The command is then given to kill every male child and every woman who has known a man. These are not ambiguous texts. They are not metaphors or poetry. They present themselves as historical narrative, reporting divine commands executed in real time. And they have haunted serious readers of the Bible for centuries. Not just modern skeptics trained in human rights culture, but ancient rabbis, medieval theologians, and Reformation scholars who wrestled deeply with what they found here. The philosopher Bertrand Russell pointed to these passages as evidence that the God of the Old Testament was a moral monster. The contemporary atheist Richard Dawkins used almost identical language. And what makes their challenge difficult is not that it comes from outside the faith, but that it articulates something many sincere believers feel in their bones when they actually read these texts carefully. So what do we do with this? There are several serious responses that have been developed across the history of biblical interpretation, and I want to give each one a fair hearing. The first response is what we might call the developmental or progressive revelation approach. It argues that the Old Testament is not a flat, uniform document in which every passage carries equal theological weight. It is a record of an unfolding relationship between God and humanity, and that relationship develops over time. The moral understanding available to a Bronze Age tribal culture was genuinely limited, and God worked within those limitations rather than overriding them completely. On this view, the herem commands reflect the moral framework of ancient Near Eastern warfare, which Israel genuinely shared, and which God permitted or accommodated without necessarily endorsing in His fullest moral character. Just as Jesus says in Matthew 19 that Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of your hearts, but it was not so from the beginning. There may be divine permissions in the Old Testament that reflect human moral limitation rather than divine ideal. The theologian Peter Enns is one of the most careful advocates of this position. He argues that Israel, like every ancient nation, understood God through the cultural and moral categories available to them. When they won a battle, they attributed the victory to divine command. Their theology of warfare was shaped by their world, not handed down in complete form from heaven. The Bible, on this reading, is an honest record of that development, not a claim that every command attributed to God in it carries the same moral authority. This approach has the advantage of taking human authorship seriously, but it raises an immediate challenge. If we are allowed to question whether some divine commands in the Bible are genuinely divine, where do we stop? What prevents the whole structure from unraveling? The second response comes from within a more conservative theological framework, and is associated with thinkers like Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan, who wrote an extensive defense of the Canaanite conquest narratives called "Is God a Moral Monster?" Their argument works on several levels simultaneously. First, they draw attention to the literary genre of ancient Near Eastern warfare accounts. Phrases like "leave no survivors" and "totally destroy them" were standard hyperbolic language in military victory accounts across the ancient world. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that nations regularly describe total annihilation in their military records, even when the actual historical events involve partial conquest, displacement, or surrender. The language of Herem may function more as a rhetorical declaration of absolute devotion to the divine cause than as a precise description of what literally happened to every individual. And the biblical text itself seems to support this reading. In Joshua 10, we are told that Joshua destroyed everyone in certain cities, leaving no survivors. But just a few chapters later, in Joshua 15 and Judges 1, the same people groups are still living in the same areas, negotiating with Israel, making treaties, intermarrying. If the total destruction was literal and complete, how are they still there? Copan and Flanagan argue that the commands were directed at combatants and military forces, not civilian populations, and that the literary hyperbole describing total destruction was understood by ancient audiences the way we understand phrases like "we destroyed the other team" or "we annihilated the competition." Intense, exaggerated language of victory, not a body count. Second, they contextualize the Canaanite situation within the broader biblical narrative. The Canaanite peoples are described in Genesis 15 as a culture whose iniquity is not yet complete, suggesting that the divine patience extended for centuries before judgment fell. By the time of the conquest accounts, those cultures practiced child sacrifice, ritualized sexual violence, and forms of religious brutality that the biblical text consistently condemns. That does not make the extermination of children morally comfortable, but it does situate it within a framework of divine judgment on civilization-level evil, rather than arbitrary ethnic cleansing. The third response is perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated, and it comes from thinkers who take what we might call the divine command theory of morality seriously. The argument goes like this: our intuitions about what is morally right and wrong are not independent, self-generating truths that float free of any ultimate grounding. They are themselves derived from somewhere. And if God is the source of all moral reality, then the question of whether God can command something that strikes us as wrong is more complicated than it first appears. The philosopher Alvin Plantinga and others have argued that if God is the creator and sustainer of all life, then he's different from the relationship of one human being to another. When God takes a human life, it is not murder in the sense we mean when we apply that category to human actions, because God is not a fellow creature killing another creature. He is the author of life exercising a sovereignty over it that no creature possesses. On this view, the problem of the Canaanite commands is not that God did something immoral. It is that we are applying a moral category designed for creature-to-creature relationships to a creator-to-creature relationship, and the fit is imperfect. This is not an easy answer. It sits uncomfortably with our intuitions about the intrinsic dignity of every human being, including children and infants, and it risks putting God beyond moral critique in a way that could be used to justify almost anything. The same logic, applied carelessly, could become the theological cover for atrocities committed by human beings who believe they are acting as God's instruments. Serious thinkers in this tradition are aware of that danger and try to build careful guardrails around the argument. But the discomfort does not go away entirely, and perhaps it should not. Now, I want to bring a different kind of lens to this question, because I think there is a dimension of it that purely analytical responses tend to miss. The Old Testament is not only a record of divine commands, it is also a record of human responses to those commands, including responses of negotiation, protest, and moral pushback that God himself seems to honor. Abraham, the father of faith, haggles with God over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He pushes back, he argues, he asks whether the judge of all the earth will not do right, and God engages the argument rather than silencing it. Moses intercedes for Israel after the golden calf incident and argues God out of destroying the entire nation. The text says, God relented of the disaster he had planned. A God who can be argued with, who changes course in response to human moral reasoning, is not a God who operates by issuing unchangeable decrees from behind an impenetrable wall. Job accuses God of injustice for the entirety of his book, and is ultimately told by God that he spoke what was right, unlike his theologically tidy friends who never challenged anything. The prophet Habakkuk opens his book by confronting God directly. "How long, Lord, must I call for help but you do not listen? How long will you tolerate wrong?" God responds not by condemning the complaint, but by engaging it. There is something in the Hebrew tradition itself, embedded in the very text that contain the disturbing commands, that models honest moral engagement with God rather than silent compliance. The tradition of lament, of wrestling, of questioning, is not a deviation from faithful relationship with God in the Old Testament. It is one of its characteristic features. But let me press further into something that I think is the deepest issue beneath all of these responses. Every one of the frameworks we have discussed, whether progressive revelation, literary hyperbole, divine command theory, or contextual judgment, is ultimately an attempt by a human mind to make sense of a God who refuses to be fully contained by human moral categories. And maybe that is exactly where the honest reader should land. Not in the comfortable place where everything has been explained and the difficulty dissolved. Not in the despairing place where the difficulty proves there is no God worth trusting. But in the genuinely difficult, genuinely honest place where you hold two things at once. The first thing is this. These texts are genuinely morally disturbing. You are not wrong to feel disturbed. You are not being faithless or rebellious by finding the slaughter of infants incompatible with your deepest moral intuitions. Those intuitions are not arbitrary cultural prejudices. They are, in the biblical framework itself, a reflection of the image of God written into human beings. The same God who is the source of those moral intuitions is the one whose commands we are trying to interpret. The second thing is this. The full biblical narrative moves in a specific direction. It moves from the God who commands armies to the God who becomes a refugee in Egypt, from the God who sends plagues to the God who absorbs them, from the God who destroys enemies to the God who on a Roman cross prays for those who are killing him, from a covenant sealed with animal sacrifice to a covenant sealed with his own blood. The trajectory of the biblical story is not from a mild God to a demanding one. It is from a God accommodating himself to the brutal moral logic of the ancient world to a God who finally, in the incarnation, subverts that entire logic from the inside. Jesus is the interpretive key, not just a theological ornament placed on top of the Old Testament, but the lens through which its whole story becomes readable. And Jesus' own reading of the Old Testament is not one that endorses violence. It is one that consistently radicalizes mercy and redefines what faithfulness to God actually looks like. There is a moment in Luke chapter 9 that I think captures this perfectly, and it is not often connected to this discussion, but it should be. The disciples James and John, traveling with Jesus through Samaria, encounter a village that refuses to welcome them. And the disciples ask Jesus, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them, just as Elijah did?" They are invoking precedent. They are doing exactly what a serious student of the Old Testament might do. They are reading their history and applying it. And Jesus rebukes them sharply. The text says, "He turned and rebuked," not a footnote. It is a theological statement. The one who is the fullest revelation of God's character does not recognize himself in the fire from heaven logic, even when it has scriptural support. He redirects his followers toward a different way of understanding what God is actually like. The theologian Greg Boyd spent years developing what he calls a cruciform hermeneutic, a way of reading the Old Testament through the cross. His argument is that the cross is the ultimate revelation of what God is willing to do, which is to absorb violence rather than inflict it, to take the worst of human cruelty and transform it rather than retaliate against it. Any reading of the Old Testament that contradicts that revelation needs to be held more loosely, interpreted more carefully, or understood as a layer of the story that the story itself eventually moves beyond. That is not a conservative position, and it is not a liberal one. It is an attempt to read the whole canon with Christ at the center, which is precisely what the earliest Christians claimed to be doing. Let me say something now that is important for people of faith who are genuinely troubled by this question. You do not have to have a complete, airtight answer to these texts in order to maintain an intellectually honest faith. The theologians and scholars who have spent their careers on these questions do not have airtight answers. What they have is a set of serious, careful, partial responses that together do something important. They demonstrate that the question does not have a simple, obvious answer in either direction. It does not simply prove that God is a monster, and it does not simply dissolve into comfortable resolution. The Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, one of the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, said something that has stayed with me. He said that the Bible is unique among ancient religious texts in that it contains within itself the resources for its own moral critique. The same tradition that contains the Herem commands contains Abraham arguing with God, contains the prophets condemning the exploitation of the poor, contains the insistence that God requires justice and mercy more than sacrifice. The text carries within it an ongoing moral conversation, not a static moral decree. That conversation has not ended. You are part of it right now. Here is where I want to leave you today. The existence of these difficult texts is not an accident. A religious tradition that wanted to construct a comfortable, marketable version of God would have edited them out centuries ago. The fact that they survived, that they are still there, in all their disturbing force, is itself a kind of testimony to the honesty of the tradition. The Bible does not present a God who has been sanitized for your protection. It presents a God who is genuinely engaged with human history in all of its violence, confusion, and moral complexity. A God who works through imperfect people, imperfect institutions, and imperfect understandings. Not because he has no better option, but because that is what it looks like to actually enter into relationship with real human beings, rather than theoretical ones. And the story that begins in the violent landscapes of the ancient Near East does not stay there. It moves, it develops, it culminates in a God who hangs on a cross between two criminals, who refuses to call down the fire that his own disciples thought was justified, who says from that cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." That is not the end of the questions, but it is the clearest picture we have of who God ultimately is and where the story is ultimately going. And a God who moves in that direction is a God worth continuing to wrestle with, even in the darkest and most disturbing corners of the text. Thank you for staying with me through one of the most uncomfortable episodes we have done. Discomfort is not always the enemy of faith. Sometimes it is the growing edge. If this episode gave you language for something you have been carrying quietly, or opened a conversation you have been afraid to have, pass it along. These are the questions that matter. I'll see you in the next one.